Welcome, everybody, back to Medical Education in the New Millennium. Today's topic is Massively Learning Together and Scaling Distributed Learning. I'm one of the course directors, Nikita Joshi, and today we're very excited to have Dr. Daphne Kohler here, president of Coursera. But our Ignite speaker for today is Nicholas Vu. Nicholas is a pharmacy student at the University of California in San Diego. He's also a Stanford Medicine X student advisor. He holds a BA in biochemistry from the University of Minnesota and has worked for 4 years as a pharmacy technician at Health Partners. First, a brief word.
Welcome to Medical Education in the New Millennium, a new course from the Stanford University School of Medicine. This interdisciplinary course is produced by Stanford Medicine X and features talks from thought leaders and innovators from medical education, instructional design, cognitive science, online learning, and emerging technology. Over the course of 11 weeks, we'll consider how to build educational experiences that address the unique learning preferences of today's millennial medical students and residents, address gaps in the current medical education system, and explore what might be accomplished when all healthcare stakeholders are included in the conversation. If you are joining us for the first time, a quick reminder that there's a simultaneous conversation happening on Twitter right now using the hashtag MedX. Christopher Snyder, otherwise known as I Am Spartacus, is the in-class moderator for today's program and will be taking questions from social media. So please make sure to start up your Twitter client to join in the online conversation and interact with today's speakers. Please also make sure to like our Facebook page at www.facebook.com/StanfordMedX. Please note, you are watching a live online program and there is a delay between real-time events and the live stream you are watching. Tweets from our in-class guests will appear before you see the real-time events they are tweeting about unfold on the video live stream.
All right, hi. So my name is Nicholas Vu, and here's my Ignite talk. And it's going to model the Ignite talk of a former Ignite speaker, Rohit Kakade, who came and talked to you about medicine, education, technology, and possibilities. However, my talk is going to be more pharmacy focused. So today, I'm going to talk to you about pharmacy, education, technology, and possibilities of MOOCs. So currently, this is my joking perception of the role of technology in education. As many of you know, there are a lot of students that don't attend class and then end up just listening to the podcast or the video of that class in lieu of their presence in the actual course. And this is just a student that's jokingly bribing her PE teacher to accept her cell phone in lieu of her presence in her PE course. So just a quick blurb on an update on the state of the pharmacy industry. So in the past, pharmacists have been extremely focused on the role of drug-drug interactions, adverse drug reactions, contraindications of drugs, drug-disease interactions, drug-gene interactions. And while this is extremely important and has comprised the majority of our profession in the past, there have been some recent changes this year that are expanding our clinical roles in the healthcare system. With the passing of SB 493 as of January 2014, we are now allowed to prescribe under the authorization of an MD protocol. And with this protocol now authorized, we're allowed to order laboratory tests, prescribe medications, and very importantly, prescribe very complex digital health devices and medical mobile applications. So my background with regards to MOOCs and educating in the healthcare field just comes with Dr. Philip Bourne's pharmacy informatics course. And the reason that the pharmacy students enjoyed my lectures so much was because everything that I told them was very clinically relevant. I gave them very few generalities. I showed them specifically like which digital health devices they should use, how they work, and exactly which patients they would be appropriate in. And because of this clinical relevance, I felt that they flat out told me that they really loved the presentations. So in terms of the technology's role in helping me share my interest in digital health, these are just the resources that I utilized and garnered a lot of information from in order to share what I learned with pharmacy students at the University of California, San Diego. So this is just a schematic that the clinical informatics department at UCSD uses, and I'm currently rotating through there. It's an extremely exciting department to be a part of. And this is the schematic that we use to determine how we bring a new change in the electronic medical record system we use, Epic Hyperspace, from beginning to finish. And I'm going to analogize this schematic because I think it has a lot of relevance to how MOOCs roll and how they are created from start to finish. So if you'll pay attention to these four boxes here, there's a build box, a test box, a production box, and a copy box. So in the build box, for example, we make a lot of drug alert systems. So whenever a physician is prescribing a drug, or a PA or a nurse practitioner or a pharmacist is prescribing a drug, if it's an inappropriate drug, an alert will come up and it'll tell that clinician that you shouldn't be using this. For example, there's a very commonly used antibiotic called levofloxacin and a very commonly used antipsychotic called Geodon. And when you combine these two medications, it really increases the risk of that patient experiencing some sort of cardiac abnormality, especially if they had some sort of comorbidity of a cardiac abnormality in the past. So after we design this drug alert system, the physician is supposed to receive that alert. But before we bring that to the production phase, we have the physician play with that alert system in a test module in Epic Hyperspace. And then after it passes the test module, it's actually put into a real live patient profile in a real live physician-patient interaction setting. And then after that, that successful interaction with that drug alert model, at the end of the day, a copy of it is made right here. And then that copy is used to educate other departments in the UCSD health system, or used as clinical advice for other departments in the UCSD health system, as well as sharing in other universities and other hospitals across the country. So analogously, I believe MOOCs have these same four steps. So in the building phase of MOOCs, you have the students that are learning, studying from their textbooks, building up theoretical knowledge. And then there's the test phase, the examinations that the MOOCs have you undertake. And then there's the production phase, the actual application of what you've learned and been tested on in a real job. And then after you've applied that in an actual real life setting, there's mass distribution of what you've learned and applied in a real job setting. So MOOCs, building, testing, production phase, and then a copy phase. So, and if any of you wanted to learn more about the role of clinical informatics in this field, I'd be happy to talk after. So the challenges that I see for MOOCs is just really one key one is motivating students to utilize technology for educational purposes on top of their current course load. As you all know, as students, we have an extremely heavy course load. So and adding on another MOOC on top of that course load can be a bit of a challenge. So and then the second one is validating these MOOCs to fulfill the requirements of degree-seeking programs. For example, I found a MOOC that involved a pharmacy practice course based out of the Ohio State University. And while my pharmacy school offers that exact same class in person, and it's the exact same material, there's no way that MOOC would actually fulfill the requirements of my PharmD curriculum. So for the public policy students in the room, I think there's a lot of room for validating these MOOCs in an actual degree-seeking program. And then the future of MOOCs in pharmacy, I believe there's a huge role for MOOCs to educate other student pharmacists about the role of pharmacists in recommending digital health devices, as well as how to write these physician-authorized protocols where pharmacists are allowed to prescribe. Thank you so much for your time. And next, I'm going to introduce our guest speaker for the day. Her name is Dr. Daphne Kohler. She is the Rajiv Motwani Professor at the Computer Science Department of Stanford University. Her major research interests include developing and using machine learning and probabilistic methods for analyzing complex domains and building models for these complex domains as well. She's currently actually on leave from Stanford University to serve as the president of Coursera, a major MOOC company. And she's responsible for developing the business and developing major partnerships with major universities across the world. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Daphne Kohler after a brief moment from Medicine X.
In 2015, Medicine X will be launching a new program called Medicine X Ed. This special conference, right before Medicine X 2015, will focus on medical education and what might be accomplished when all healthcare stakeholders can engage in a conversation about changing the culture of medicine through educational innovation. Of course, we'll discuss the role technology can play in medical education, but we'll also look at gaps in our current educational system, such as participatory medicine, shared decision-making, patient engagement, cost transparency, patient safety and reducing harm, and cross-cultural competencies. What other gaps might we address at Medicine X Ed? Let us know what you think by tweeting our hashtag MedX. And make sure to sign up online to learn more about Medicine X Ed and how you can get involved.
Good evening, and thank you for being here. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the work that we've been doing at Coursera for just a little over 2.5 years. So you can see the title of the talk is Open Education Beyond an Experiment. So I'm going to start with the experiment and then hope to convince you that we've moved beyond that. The experiment actually started right here at Stanford University in almost exactly 3 years ago, in October of 2011, when, based on several years worth of work that myself and colleagues at Stanford had been doing on technology facilitated education, we decided to take 3 graduate courses in computer science and open them up for everyone around the world to take for free. We had no idea what would happen. We thought maybe a few hundred or a few thousand students would enroll, but what we saw is that within a matter of weeks, each of those courses had an enrollment of 100,000 learners or more. 100,000 is not a number that one typically hears very much in academia, and when you think about the order of magnitude, the largest of these courses as taught at Stanford had an enrollment of 400 students, so it was considered one of those large lecture courses that we all like to complain about. In order to reach that same number of students by teaching at Stanford, that course would have had to be taught for 250 years. But it's not just the scale, it's also the fact that those people came from every country, every age group, and every walk of life. So there was a real opportunity to democratize the access to an educational experience that had been available only to a tiny number of very privileged Stanford students, like many of you here in this room. So we decided that we couldn't just leave this alone and go back to the lab and write some more papers. And thinking about what to do, we realized that while Stanford had a lot of really great courses, there's a lot of other universities out there that also have a lot to offer. And so in early 2012, we spun this out of Stanford as a separate entity, Coursera, that was supposed to work with multiple top universities. We launched in April 2012, so just about 2.5 years ago, with 4 university partners, Stanford, Princeton, Penn, and Michigan. We had 37 courses and 200,000 learners left over from the Stanford experiments. So fast forward 2.5 years later, this is a relatively, should be, hello. Recent screenshot, thank you. Not quite as recent as it could be. So we now have 115 partners from over 20 different countries, top universities from the United States, Europe, Asia, Latin America, Australia, and from all different types of disciplines. Many of the top US universities that you would recognize beyond the ones that I mentioned, Yale, Columbia, University of Washington, Georgia Tech, and many others are Coursera partners. They currently offer over 780 courses across a range of disciplines to over 10 million learners worldwide. And I'll talk a little bit about the learners later on. And this is, okay. So let me give you a few cool little statistics just as fun. There's been over 1,500 sessions offered on Coursera so far. Over 100 million hours of videos have been watched. Over 51 million quizzes have been submitted, and over 1.5 million distinct course completions. So that's an awful lot of learning. The structure of this talk now is in 3 pieces. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about what are these courses like, what's the learner experience. Then I'll talk about who are the learners that are taking these courses, and finally I will end with why are we doing this. So the courses are not lecture capture from the back of the classroom. These are courses that are made for online consumption. So these are short, modular, punchy videos, 6 minutes, 10 minutes, that are really focused on conveying a single concept with crisply defined learning outcomes. Furthermore, by breaking away from the constraints of in-class teaching, you can actually create learning experiences you couldn't possibly do within a classroom. So for example, here's a sustainability class from the University of Illinois, which is shot literally in the field. Here's an introduction to sociology class from Princeton, where they're having a discussion about a sociological issue with 10 learners from 10 different countries around the world, each representing their own localized perspective on this problem. And so these are just 2 out of many examples of the kind of innovation that this type of modality opens up. Now, lecture videos are great, but you really want to make them engaging and interactive. And so one of the technologies that we've put in place to do that is something that we called in-video quizzes. In-video quizzes are pauses that happen at the yellow notches that you see in that image. The video pauses and the learner gets asked a question. The question can be a content question. Did you understand what I just said? Or what is the next step that I'm going to do? But it can also be a survey question, like what do you think about this? Upon which, after the learner answers the question, there is an immediate, it gives them a sense of what the overall distribution of responses within this worldwide audience is, and it gives them a sense that they're part of a broader community. Now, these are really engaging, and when you think about the analog in a traditional on-campus class in an auditorium, it's the kind of question that you might ask as an instructor, but when there's 200 people sitting in the auditorium, maybe 2 or 3 people can actually engage with the question before it gets answered and the class moves on. And here, every single learner engages with the material much more. Now, these in-video quizzes are fun, but they're not where the real learning happens. Real learning happens when you actually have to sit down and actively work out some problems. And that really establishes a challenge, because if you have 100,000 learners in a course, actually 40,000 is our median course, it's actually kind of hard to provide grades and meaningful feedback to 40,000 learners when you don't have 10,000 teaching assistants. So one technology for addressing grading at scale is, of course, auto-grading, where the computer does the grading for you. Now, you can do multiple choice, obviously, but you can also do short answer questions, computer programs, computer models, Excel spreadsheets, anything that has a structured form as an output, as well as mathematical expressions, can all be graded by a computer. Turns out that our instructors can find really creative ways to utilize this technology. This is one of my favorites. This is Professor Mike Schatz, who teaches physics at Georgia Tech, and his MOOC is called Introductory Physics 1 with Laboratory. How do you teach a lab class when your learners are in Ghana and Bangladesh and don't have access to a lab? So Mike developed an idea where the learners basically perform the experiments using objects that are found in their own environments, like balls and tables and things like that. And then they record the experiment using a camera, like their cell phone, upload it onto the site, and in order for him to assess whether they did the experiment and the measurements correctly, he has an image tracking software that he developed that tracks moving objects, computes accelerations and velocities, and then that serves as the ground truth for the experimental analysis that the learner did. And so it's actually a really cool and engaging way for people to do a lab class when they don't have access to a lab. This is part 1 of the story. I'm going to come back to part 2 at the end of the talk. Now, one of the nice things about auto-grading is that it's not just a scalability technology, it also has pedagogical benefits. Specifically, when you submit a question, an answer to a question, you immediately get told whether you're right or wrong. And that's really valuable because when you compare that to a traditional grading mechanism, when it happens 3 weeks after you've learned the material, by that point, if you then realize that you don't actually understand the material completely, it's too late to go back and relearn it because the class has moved on. Here, because of the immediate feedback and in many cases the opportunity to resubmit, there is the opportunity to do mastery learning and really understand the topic before you move on to the next, building on much sounder foundations. And we've done data analytics to demonstrate that learners who actually engage in this kind of mastery activity do better not just on this assessment, but also on a summative assessment at the end of the course. Now, of course, this only gets you so far. As we know in many disciplines, medicine, of course, included, one needs things that cannot be graded automatically by a computer. For example, medical case studies. So here's an example of an assignment in Johns Hopkins, which is really a case study in Alzheimer's disease. And what we've done in order to make this possible is a technology called peer grading or peer assessment, where the learners first submit the assignment. Having done that, they get a rubric that was designed by the instructor that allows them to very carefully assess the correctness of the work provided by their peers. They each grade, say, 5 of those assignments. And then after that, they see the results. In some cases, even before they see the results, they're also asked to provide an assessment of their own performance using that same grading rubric. So this is, again, a really interesting technology because it too has pedagogical benefits beyond the scalability ones, because we are told by our learners very consistently that they learn as much or more from having to think critically about what their peers did well and not so well as they do by doing the assignments on their own. And by then having to go back and think critically about their own work, they learn even more. And so it's a really valuable learning experience. And it also opens the door to the kind of creative courses that you would not think could be done as a MOOC. So here's one such course from Wharton Business School at the University of Pennsylvania. This is Professor Carl Ehrlich, who teaches a design course, which is an 8-week project course. It starts out from defining a problem, a concept, a prototype, and finally an actual artifact. And at each stage of this 8-week course, the learners get feedback from 5 people. So by the end, they've gotten 40 pieces of feedback, which can really help them produce designs that Professor Ulrich tells us are often as good as what he sees from his Wharton students. And in fact, several of the projects in this course have led to learners starting companies based on those designs. And you get some really cool and inspiring projects in these courses. So I'm just going to give you one example. This is a course called Social Psychology from Wesleyan University. Wesleyan is a liberal arts college, so Professor Scott Plouse teaches usually relatively small classes, but his MOOC was the largest MOOC we've ever offered. It had 250,000 people. Now, which you would not necessarily expect in a social psychology class, but he's an amazing teacher. The final project that was peer graded in this class was called the Day of Compassion. The learners in the class lived 24 hours embodying the virtue of compassion and analyzed their experiences using the tools taught in the class. They wrote that up and it was assessed using peer grading. The top graded assignments were then ranked by the learners, and the top one, the grand prize winner, Balesh Jindal, actually got the grand prize of coming to Stanford to meet the Dalai Lama. Now, I'll tell you about Balesh's project, but as I tell you about Balesh's project and you're inspired by it, I want you to remember that several thousand people did this assignment, and 700 got a perfect score. So probably the other 699 are maybe almost as inspiring as this. Balesh decided to do something about the problem of sexual violence against girls and women in India, which is unfortunately quite prevalent. So she's a physician. She went to a local girls' school for girls from lower income families with 2,000 girls and held sessions about what sexual violence meant in small groups. Identified, sadly, several dozen girls who had been victims of sexual violence by a neighbor, a family member, a teacher, and is now giving them pro bono consulting in her clinic on an ongoing basis with their mothers. And at the same time, she was so inspired by her experiences that she convinced several of her fellow physicians to do the same thing for other girls' schools in India. So think about how much impact Scott Plouse, who usually teaches a few dozen students at Wesleyan, has had on the world by teaching 250,000 people, of whom this is one. The final piece of the learner experience that I'd like to talk about is the really amazing breadth of learners that are reached by one of these courses. And this has really interesting ramifications, because when you teach a class, all of a sudden you get the perspectives not of the 36 people, relatively homogeneous population that attend your Stanford class, but of all of these people from so many diverse backgrounds. So here's an example of a professor who taught terrorism and counterterrorism and understood attitudes on terrorism worldwide, which really helped inspire his research. But this is not the only example. So one in the medical space is in one of those Johns Hopkins classes that I showed a moment ago, which the Alzheimer's course, where they found out that the people who were taking the course, they expected those to be medical practitioners. And indeed, about half were. And about half were home caregivers and even patients with early inception of the disease. And that really helped create empathy among the professional caregivers to what it meant to be living with this disease. And so it really helps create and provide new perspectives to people. So I'm actually going to skip past this because we started a little bit late. So I'm just going to go on to the next piece. So who are our learners? So let's talk a little bit about that. Our learners come 1/3 each from the US, from other developed economies like Europe or Australia, and 1/3 come from emerging economies. And these are not just emerging economies like Brazil and India, although that too. They actually come from every single country in the world. Most recently, we checked and we even have learners from Antarctica and North Korea, which is kind of bizarre. And you can see 4% come from Africa, 25% from Asia, 11% from Latin America, and so very broad diversity. Now, if you look at the actual growth curves in terms of the number of learners, you can see there's, going up. US is at the top, so I took it off the graph. But India, China is about to overtake India. I'll talk about that in a second. Brazil has just overtaken the UK last month. Spain, Mexico, Nigeria, Indonesia, and so on. I'd like to talk a little bit about the kink in the China curve, because this is actually kind of cool. You notice that really steep change in the gradient. That's when we actually did our China launch, translated a whole bunch of content into Chinese, put content behind the Chinese firewall to increase the bandwidth, and so on and so forth. And as a consequence of that, whereas year-on-year site-wide growth has been 85%, in China has been 330%. So this penetration into emerging economies really makes a difference, and we recently did a similar thing in Brazil. How do you get that level of penetration? I talked about internationalization and translation, and sure enough, it makes a big difference. So how do you translate hundreds of courses into dozens of languages? Well, in October, so we're fortunate because we have a learner community that feels blessed to be getting this gift of education, and as a consequence, many of them want to give something back. In April 2014, so 6 months ago, we launched a global translator community, which comprises volunteers from among our learners. Over 40,000 people have volunteered to translate the content for free. There are several thousand of them that are active at any given point, and over 140 courses have been translated. When you translate even just the subtitles, this leads to a 3x improvement in enrollments within the target language group. When you translate the entire course, an experiment that we've done just once, so I wouldn't give too much confidence to that particular number, enrollment goes up by 6x. So this is a very big thing in order to increase penetration. Another thing that we've done in order to increase penetration is a network of what we call learning hubs. Learning hubs is a project that we actually started in collaboration with the US State Department, leveraging the facilities of US embassies abroad. These are spaces that the embassies have that they make available to groups of learners who want to study together and take the MOOC as a group. They provide not only the facilities and the internet connection, but also a facilitator who can basically lead the discussion. And the US embassies report a completion rate of approximately 70 to 100% in those groups. Now, this despite language barriers. It's now rolling in, I think, close to 70 different embassies around the world. We then had other partnerships with the New York Public Library System, the Carlos Slim Foundation with its network of a couple thousand digital libraries in Mexico and Spanish-speaking LATAM, and a really cool, inspiring effort by a faculty member at the University of Geneva who actually created a learning hub in the Dadaab refugee camp in Kenya that used a trailer with solar panels on the roof in order to bring power there. So I'm going to skip past this because we're, as I said, I want to leave room for time for Q&A. So one of the criticisms that has been often repeated about MOOCs is the retention. Only 5% of people who begin a MOOC complete the MOOC. That's true. What the statistic fails to consider is the fact that most people who sign up for a MOOC have no intent to complete the MOOC. Most of them are browsing. Half of the ones who sign up, by the time the course begins, often a month or two later, don't even bother to show up for the first day. So half is lost right there. Of the ones who show up on the first day, half don't come back after watching the first lecture because, you know, they thought that astrobiology was about UFOs and it turns out that it's a real science class. So you basically lose people at all sorts of stages, and then you have a whole bunch of people who just treat this as a documentary, which means they watch a bunch of videos, but they never submit even a single assignment. So when you look at a slightly better statistic, which is after the shopping period, just like we have here at Stanford, say 3 weeks or 4 weeks into the course, you ask people, how committed are you to completing the course? That number gets up to about 60%. And then depending on the course, people who actually put a little bit of skin in the game and sign up for earning a certificate, like in something like $40 or $50, the numbers can end up being over 80% completion rates. So that's, you know, a little bit more interesting as a comparison to completion rates of, say, on-campus courses. Nevertheless, and this echoes a question that I heard someone ask just before this session began, is there are still a lot of people who begin a course with intent to complete and fail to do that. Now, the number one reason why that happens is because students missed a deadline because life got in the way. And this is where it's important to remember that our learners are working adults. They have kids, they have jobs, they have mortgages to pay, and some things and they can't structure their life around their education in the way that a college student can. And so right now we're actually transitioning our teaching to what we call an on-demand learning model, where the course is available all the time and you can make your way through it at any pace that you want. Now, you might ask yourself, well, what happens if you have all sorts of people coming in at different points in time? Doesn't that ruin the social fabric of the educational experience? And the answer is, it could, but when you have 1,000 people starting the course in any given week, there's still going to be a whole bunch of people with you in your module, even if they didn't start at the same time and didn't end at the same time. And so there is still a community and still people to talk to about something that excites you about the material. And furthermore, if you're a group like a learning hub or an on-campus class that wants to take the class together, you can still take it as a group and simply go through the content together, like with a group of friends, kind of like a book club. So the final piece that I want to talk about is the why. Why are we doing this? And I'm going to talk about two pieces of this: improving learning and transforming lives. So first, in terms of improving learning, I'm going to talk about the improvements that it can make to on-campus students, because I think it's important to realize that the improvements in learning that we make for the non-on-campus students are enormous, because what we start off with is generally absolutely nothing, as in they have no access and this provides them access. So let's talk about the improvements that this could make on campus. The first is flipping the classroom, and I'm sure this is a concept that's familiar here, where you do the content online, do some basic skill building online, and then come into class to do some active learning, problem solving, and so on, for a much more interactive and engaging experience. Most medical schools, I think, are gradually moving over into this form of education, and it actually is much better. I'm not going to read these quotes in detail, but faculty who do this say, I will never, ever, ever teach a class any other way as far as I can tell. This is so much better. The students learn so much more. And indeed, the students do learn so much more. So this is a study that was done at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. They've been doing flipped classroom teaching for a decade, long before MOOCs ever came on the scene. And this is what they see. This is introductory courses in engineering. And what you see here is that the tail of the distribution of the people who were getting failing grades in a traditional lecture course now shifts over to the right to have a passing score. So the failure rates in these flipped classroom models is much, much lower, both because people who start out with less background have a chance to catch up by learning on their own, not missing half of what the instructor says because they've kind of lost track of the lecture, and because of the hand-holding that they get when they come to do their flipped classroom piece in class. The second aspect of this is innovation in improvement in teaching. So a lot of our instructors talk about this as an experimental platform for testing out new course ideas and new forms of pedagogy. Coming back to the Mike Schatz example, he tried this in his MOOC, and interestingly, what happened is that his Georgia Tech students, who have access to world-class lab facilities, said, wait a minute, why should I go into the lab and do a cookie cutter experiment that thousands of students have done before me? I want to do my labs in the wild too. And so now all of his Georgia Tech students are doing their labs in basketball courts, and then they're coming into class to do a flipped classroom engagement, which is like little lab sessions where one student describes his experiment and other students critique how he did it. So it's actually, and he says this is a much more engaging thing because it ties physics more closely to their daily lives. Skipping past this. A final way of improving teaching is big data. And this is one that's often unappreciated until you see it. This is Professor Ignacio Martinez from University of Virginia, who says learning is often a black box in the classroom. MOOCs allow us to see what students are doing, and with hundreds of thousands of students, if there is a correlation to be found, we will find it. So let's look at what that means. This is one of our dashboards for looking at, for the instructor side, for looking at assessments. And what you see here is, first of all, the grade distribution for a quiz, but also for each quiz question, what is the first attempt and the last attempt for the distribution for students. And when you pull up the data, you can find examples like this. These are 4 variants of the same question that the instructor thought were equivalent and is randomizing. So some students get one variant and others get a different one. And what you notice is that 2 of these are at a 50% pass rate. This is a true-false question. And 2 are at 90%. Obviously, these are not equal variants. And obviously, there's something wrong with the ones that are at the 50%. And so now the instructor can come in and understand what they did wrong. Maybe it was the video that preceded it, maybe the question was ill-formed, and fix it. And the nice thing is that especially when you're teaching on demand, you think you have an idea on what is broken, you fix it. And the next week you have 1,000 new people to tell you whether you actually fixed it or not. So by the time you come back and teach this class at Stanford a semester later, your class is ever so much better than it was when you started. And this is really valuable because if you think of the Google of today relative even to the Google of a year ago, the reason why you see all these differences is that because they try new things every week, and every week they have enough data to tell them whether their experiments are making the experience better, and that's why there's a constant improvement. We've never been able to do that in pedagogy because of the lack of data and because of the slow iteration cycle. The last piece that I'm going to talk about is transforming lives. And I can stand here for literally an hour and give you learner stories that will inspire you and in many cases bring tears to your eyes. I'm just going to give you 3. Or maybe even 2, so we leave time for questions. So this is Sharmeen. Sharmeen lives in Bangladesh and she's a social activist and a baker. She was distressed by the fact that in Bangladesh, girls are often sold into indentured servitude to a husband or an employer. She convinced a friend to run away with her and they opened a bakery. Unfortunately, neither she nor her friend knew how to run a business, and so the bakery was floundering. So she searched online for some resources to help her, and she discovered some of our courses. She started out with an econ course from Penn, followed by a model thinking course from Michigan, followed by a course from Michigan and Irvine and Penn and Wharton, and she learned how to run a business. So now, her bakery is earning not $900 a month, but $5,000 a month, which is enough to support not just her and her friend, but also 5 other women who are therefore not living in a life of servitude. And she makes sure that every week they have time to also take online classes so that they can improve their lives. That's one. Very different, maybe closer to home. Scotty is a 47-year-old undergraduate student from Louisiana. He was a star student in high school, received a full scholarship to attend UT Austin, and was unable to take it because he needed to work to support his family. Took a menial job, was living paycheck to paycheck when he was laid off in 2005. He lost his house, lost his wife, lost custody of his 13-year-old daughter, and was living in a car, and promised himself that this would never happen again if he managed to break out of this downward spiral. So when he found a job as a horse groomer, the first thing he looked for was online college credit, and somehow managed to find us even though we don't grant credit. He said that it was challenging to think about going to school because he had a total of 6 credits to his name and had not been inside a classroom for almost 30 years. So he took some online courses, started out with the University of Michigan course on internet history, and by the time he finished the course, he says, I had gained some confidence in my ability to be a successful student. So he went back to school to a regular degree program, and in April of 2013 was named the Outstanding Sophomore of the Year and was later inducted into the International Honor Society for Psychology. So a different example. And I'm going to skip past this and talk about one last slide and then reminding ourselves why this matters, especially in the medical space. So, taking a big step back for a moment. One of our instructors, Professor Christian Turwish from Wharton, did an analysis of Coursera from an operations management perspective. It's actually available on YouTube. It's a wonderful video. One of his insights is that education, by force almost, is a trade-off along a Pareto optimal curve, where you trade off faculty productivity, the number of students taught in an hour, to learning outcomes. So if this is the curve and you think about the large lecture hall, then pretty decent faculty productivity, you can cover maybe 400 people, learning outcomes so-so. Individual instruction, as in office hours, great learning outcomes, horrible productivity. He argues that MOOCs are a new frontier, and it's up to us how we use it. So we can take the quality of education of a large lecture hall, maybe even a little bit better because of the dynamic personalization of the self-paced learning, and offer it not to 400 people, but to 400,000 people, or maybe 4 million people. And so you might not be improving learning outcomes by a whole lot, but you're sure as heck increasing access to a whole lot of people. Or you can take the same quality, or you can take the same amount of time that an instructor spends creating content and grading exercises, and instead spend it on blended learning, on flipping the classroom. And you may not be improving the productivity to your on-campus students, but you're hopefully, as we saw from the data, improving their learning outcomes. And these are 2 points on the spectrum. And it's up to us how we can leverage this technology to pick a point that is appropriate to our target audience and the goals that we're trying to achieve. So I'm going to end with reminding us why this is important, especially in the context of medical education. Let's take sub-Saharan Africa as an example. Sub-Saharan Africa has 24% of the world's disease burden and 3% of the world's physicians. Their current medical schools are producing 10,000 students, 10,000 graduates a year, but they need 167,000. So it's going to take a really long time for capacity to be built so as to address the educational problems of even just medical education, even just in Africa. There's many other parts of the world where there's a glaring lack of educational capacity and no reasonable solution on the horizon for getting access to education to that many people. Here we have the opportunity to leverage technology to take some of the best education that we've been able to offer to some of the world's most privileged people and make it available to everyone. Thank you.
So based on what you said about like peer grading and the global translation program, it seems like you're leaning on the community for a lot of stuff. How do you do quality control in that case?
That's a really good question. So first of all, in the context of the global translator community, we have a multi-tiered system. At the very bottom, there's the individual translators. They review each other's work. There is a group leader who actually coordinates the translation of any single course, and he or she does quality control. And then there's a language manager that manages the translations for the entire language and oversees the whole thing. And that in turn, these are all volunteers. And then there's the community coordinator at Coursera who oversees the entire effort. In the context of things like peer feedback and so on, where we've recently actually recruited community mentors to help provide that feedback, we recruit from the very best in the course. That is, we don't just pick random people. We look at people who have successfully completed the course, have successfully provided valuable feedback on the forums and in other places to the other people in the course, and then we invite them to come and participate. And quite remarkably, our success rate, and remember, these are often very busy people with a job, our success rate is close to 50% in terms of the people who are invited. 40 to 50% of them accept the invitation. And and you're right, I think it's one of the beauties, one of the really amazing aspects of this is that we've effectively learned how to crowdsource an educational experience at very high quality. Wow, lots of hands.
With so many students learning, hundreds and thousands of students in single MOOC classes, you have adjusted for language diversity. How have you addressed technical skill set ability? Because you have so many, not only languages, but ages. Mm-hmm. And as you mentioned, students coming from developed and developing countries. So their knowledge and ability to use technology that's needed in order to learn in a MOOC is, of course, very varied as well.
I think that's a really good question. The question is, how do we account for diversity, not just in language, but also in learning skills, both technological skills, how to use a computer, and how effective are you as a learner? If someone doesn't know how to use a computer, we can't, via online education, teach him or her how to use a computer. Some of that is addressed by the Learning Hub effort, which does allow for some face-to-face interaction. But if you're a digital illiterate, there's really nothing that we can do, and that's a problem that I think we as a society will need to solve in order to address the digital divide more broadly. It's not just specific to MOOCs. It's about everything is now becoming more and more information is coming at you digitally, and we need to bring people up to a certain level so they can benefit. We do have a variety of courses that teach, however, very basic skills. There's a UC San Diego course, an amazing course, had 190,000 people, called Learning How to Learn, and it taught basic study skills. There's courses that teach you basic employability skills. And so UC Irvine is offering a couple of those. And so there's really opportunities to teach people things that are really fundamental, a component of learning. I don't know, yes.
Thanks. Since there are quite a few MOOCs, companies, right? And it's relatively new. How do you see in the future how are MOOCs being provided in the long haul and sustaining itself?
So it's true that there is many MOOC companies. In fact, it feels like there's a new one every month. It's one of those hot areas that people say, oh, this looks cool, I could do that too. That happened in the early days of social networking. There was Facebook, there was MySpace, and then there was a whole bunch of people that tried and most did not succeed. In terms of becoming sustainable, we're actually doing a pretty decent job of that. This credentialing thing that I mentioned, which by the way is purely an optional thing. That is, the access to the course content is and will remain free. Where we charge is for this entirely optional credential that costs maybe $40 or $50 and has identity verification and unforgeability built into it. And by the way, even for that, we have a financial aid option, so that if you're a learner in Africa and you can't afford $50, you simply fill out a very short financial aid application and we waive the fee. But this has actually turned into a pretty decent revenue stream that's increasing very quickly. And so we hope that this will be enough to make us sustainable.
There's a question from Twitter from @CourageSings. One day, will you be able to earn a degree from Coursera? And if so, will it be free or will it cost money?
We are not a degree granting institution. We have no intent to become a degree granting institution. Our partners, who are some of the world's best universities, may eventually elect to provide some or all of a degree experience, it probably depends on the discipline, in an online format. And at that point, it's really up to them to decide if they want to charge for the credit. When some questions similar to that are asked of us by our partners, we say we want the content there for free so that learning is free. If you want to charge for a higher touch interaction like manual grading or office hours with the teachers or whatever, I mean, that obviously is a very is not something that has zero marginal cost per student, which is kind of where we are on the education. And so that presumably will cost a certain amount of money. But the hope is that we will be able to use economies of scale to reduce that relative to standard tuitions. But either way, it'll be something that our partners do and not us. Yes?
What are some of your greatest challenges, or I should say on your wish list on Coursera right now? In other words, it's an experiment in progress and it's going quite well. I've watched it from the early days. But right now you're at a point in the line where you've proven the work of the platform. You've made a lot of achievements, you've had a lot of features. What would you like to do?
Yeah. Yeah, the question is, we started this 2.5 years ago. Things have been going quite well. Where would we like to see this going? What is our dream? Right now, we have about 850 courses taught mostly in English, some with translations. The average university, the average big university, has a curriculum of about 4,000 to 5,000 courses. And there's going to be multiple languages. So I would like in 3 years to have not 850 courses, but 3,000 or 4,000 courses translated into multiple languages so that we can basically teach anybody, anywhere, anything they want to learn. That's half of it. The second half is I think we have a unique opportunity to really transform pedagogy. Part of the problem has been in this space that we really haven't had visibility into what students are doing, how they're learning, how well they're learning, and in many cases we haven't had the numbers to do a meaningful statistical analysis. It's very difficult to infer robust conclusions from 10 or even 50 students. And here we have the opportunity to basically do this kind of iterative refinement with large data and really learn how to teach people effectively. I think it's an amazing opportunity to basically create a new field. Over there.
This is a wonderful presentation. I'm in learning and development, so I really appreciate this. How does Coursera work with the learning institutions that you work with? Does anyone do content control? Is it at what point is content control and at what point is copyright, or is that even important? What happens to the instructors in terms of payment, or are they volunteering? Thank you.
Okay, so the question is, how do we work with our partners? Who does quality control? How are the instructors paid, if they're paid? Our platform, the institutions that we partner with are the ones that provide the content. They pay for the content development, they do quality control, they own the content. So the content ownership remains entirely within the institution, either the instructor or the institution or both. That's an institutional question. We work with the best institutions partly because we know they really value their brand and therefore they're very careful about quality control, and that's been extremely helpful to us. Now, in terms of how are the instructors paid, we rev share back with the university a portion of the revenues that comes in from the credentials. How they share revenue internally, there's tremendous variation by institution. Probably the most typical is something similar to the kind of royalty fees that you get from a patent. Is a pretty common model, but it varies significantly. One more question?
I'm really intrigued by the idea of being able to iterate on your course over and over.
Yeah.
Especially as a classroom teacher, teaching one lesson in the morning, figuring out what went wrong, and teaching it better in the afternoon. I'm wondering how you encourage professors to invest in doing that kind of iteration and avoiding the one-shot vanity MOOCs that could result.
That's a really good question. Right now, we have not been able to do this in an extensive way because On Demand only launched a couple of months ago. And when the next launch of your course is 6 or 9 months down the line, which is similar to what happens in an on-campus setting, it's very hard to motivate people. Although we have seen a fair bit of effort by our faculty members, because like when you have 50,000 people all complaining about a module of your course, that's a very powerful incentive to fix it. And so in some sense, this incentivizes faculty to make those corrections. And I think that by providing them data analytics, which basically say, look, performance on this question was flat. And then when you made this change, all of a sudden, you know, learning on this question went from 50% to 80%. That's very motivating. Tracking something and saying, wow, I did this. And it really worked. And you see an immediate impact is like really, really cool. And I think that's going to be the secret to success, tracking.
So those are all excellent questions, and we just wanted to wrap things up by thanking some of our Twitters, Ava May, Jake Orlowitz, and Nikki Estagnol for participating online. So thank you so much for your time, Dr. Daphne Kohler, the participants for all of your questions. We learned a lot, and we hope to move this forward.
Thank you.
If you like what you see in this class, be sure to check out our online course, Engage and Empower Me, a new online class from the Stanford University School of Medicine. We are featuring presentations from patients and experts on participatory medicine. Through this course, we hope to empower you to take part in creating a more inclusive and collaborative healthcare system. The course can be found at class.stanford.edu. As a reminder, this program is made possible by support from the Stanford University School of Medicine, Department of Anesthesia, Stanford AIM Lab, Stanford Hospital and Clinics, and the Agency for Healthcare Research Quality. If you haven't yet done so, please take a moment to like our Facebook page at www.facebook.com/StanfordMedX so you can continue the conversation online and stay informed of program updates. From all of us here at Stanford Medicine X, we want to thank you for joining us today and to remind you to join us again next Thursday, November 20th at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time for another edition of Stanford Medicine X Live, featuring a new class on medical education from the Stanford University School of Medicine called Medical Education in the New Millennium. Next week, the lecture is about patient safety and the medical training process. For all of you out there taking time to tune in with us tonight, thank you for joining us and being part of the conversation. A special thanks to our guest panelists this evening. From all of us at Stanford Medicine X, we'll see you next time.